The imposing figure of Marcus Thorne stood at a dusty crossroads, both literal and metaphorical, under the punishing Georgia sun. For 12 years, he had been a senior guardsman in the British Army's household cavalry, a living statue in a polished silver helmet and cuirass, mounted on a jet-black horse named Titan. His world was one of rigid ceremony, impeccable turnout, and silent, stoic endurance. He had stood unmoving for hours outside Buckingham Palace, a fixture in 1,000 tourist photographs, his discipline as unyielding as the ancient stone beneath his boots. But inside the gleaming helmet, a restless mind churned. He had joined the army for adventure and challenge, but found his existence defined by perfection of form over function. The question that haunted him during long nights in the barracks was simple. Was he a ceremonial ornament, or was he still a soldier? To find the answer, he had taken a radical step. He had volunteered for the ultimate test of infantry grit, the United States Army's Expert Infantryman Badge, or EIB. Considered one of the toughest peacetime infantry tests in the world, with a historical pass rate often below 20%, it was a grueling 5-day gauntlet of patrol tasks, weapon proficiency, and a brutal 12-mile ruck march. Marcus arrived at Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, with a trunk full of meticulous preparation and a quiet, unshakable confidence. He was, after all, a product of one of the world's most disciplined militaries. The American Evaluators, a group of hardened infantry sergeants, eyed the tall, impeccably postured Brit with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. A guardsman? Like the palace guys with the fuzzy hats, one muttered, not unkindly, but with clear doubt. Marcus simply nodded, his expression neutral. Yes, Sergeant. The first days were a cultural and physical earthquake. The EIB course was not about silent, stationary endurance. It was about violent, noisy, exhausting action. Tasks were performed at a dead run, under simulated stress, with gruff sergeants barking critiques. Marcus's precise, measured British drill movements were useless here. He fumbled with the unfamiliar M4 carbine during the first lane, his hands used to the SA-80 rifle. The patrol phase was a blur of navigating through dense woodland, calling in simulated artillery, and reacting to ambushes under the screech of blank rounds and pyrotechnics. The American candidates, mostly seasoned infantrymen, moved with a rough, efficient aggression that was foreign to him. They shouted, they joked through the pain, they helped each other with a casual brutality. Marcus, trained in solitary stoicism, initially struggled to integrate. His back ached from years in the saddle, not from humping a 50-pound ruck. The heat was different, a wet, suffocating blanket compared to London's chill. Yet, something began to stir. The very core of military discipline, the ability to absorb pressure, to follow procedures under duress, was his foundation. He began to adapt. He listened intently, his observations sharp. He noticed the little tricks the successful candidates used, the way they staged their gear, the specific cadence of their radio reports. He asked short, precise questions of the graders. His shooting, once he adjusted to the M4's rhythm, became razor-sharp. On the land navigation course, his meticulousness proved an asset. He plotted his points with cartographic precision and found them all without error. The other candidates began to look at him differently. The skepticism faded, replaced by a nod of respect when he effortlessly completed the complex medical evacuation task, his large frame handling the casualty with surprising gentleness and efficiency. They gave him a nickname, Big Ben. He didn't smile much, but he was always there, solid, uncomplaining, and increasingly competent. The tension in the camp was a palpable, living thing as the week wore on. The field of candidates, once boisterous and full, had thinned dramatically. Men Marcus had begun to know by face had fallen away, defeated by a failed task, a missed shot, or a navigational error. The ultimate gauntlet, the 12-mile ruck march in under 3 hours, loomed like a specter. But, before that, there was the final, exhaustive day of testing stations. Exhaustion was the enemy now, a heavy fog threatening to cloud judgment and slow movements. Marcus moved through the lanes in a state of focused automation. His muscles screamed, his boots felt like lead, but the ceremonial guard's training in disassociating from discomfort was his secret weapon. At the Grenade lane, his arm was a tired ache, but his throw was still a perfect, arcing lob into the target window. At the weapons assembly station, his fingers, though swollen and stiff, worked with a swift, sure memory. He didn't just complete the tasks, he executed them with a calm, unhurried precision that stood in stark contrast to the frantic energy of some remaining candidates. The American sergeants watched, their clipboards held a little looser. There was no longer any doubt about the Brits' soldiering mettle. The question had shifted from "can he do it?" to "how far will he go?" On the eve of the Ruck March, the camp was quiet, a monastery of pain. Men sat on their bunks, silently repacking their rucks, taping feet, and hydrating. Marcus sat alone, methodically checking every item on the packing list. His mind was not on the palace, nor on his fellow guardsmen back home. It was on the dusty road at dawn, on the weight he would carry, on the rhythm of his stride. He was no longer just a royal guard testing himself. He was a soldier, on the cusp of proving it in the most concrete terms possible, to an army not his own. The proof, however, would come at a terrible cost. The pre-dawn air at Fort Moore was cool and carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a brief mercy before the Georgia's sun asserted its dominance. A somber, focused group of candidates stood at the starting line, rucksacks loaded to exactly 35 pounds, not counting water and weapon. Marcus Thorne adjusted the straps on his broad shoulders, feeling the familiar yet alien weight settle. This was different from the ceremonial kit. This weight was functional, brutal. A headlamp cut through the gloom, illuminating the steely face of the lead instructor. You know the standards. 12 miles. 3 hours. Do not fall out. Your EIB depends on this last event. Move out. The first mile was a cacophony of pounding boots and labored breathing on the packed dirt road. The group stretched out, the faster ones pushing ahead, others finding a sustainable rhythm. Marcus found his pace, a powerful, ground-eating stride born from years of marching on parade squares and riding colossal horses. He settled into the middle of the pack, his mind clear, his body falling into the mechanical ritual of endurance. The stories he'd heard about this march were not exaggerated. By the 5th mile, the sun had risen, a burning white orb turning the road into a shimmering corridor of heat. The initial chatter had died, replaced by grim silence, and the sound of sloshing water in canteens. Pain became a constant companion, a hot stitch in the side, a burning in the thighs, a nagging ache where the ruck's frame met the back. Marcus's feet, so used to polished jackboots, were blistering in the standard-issue combat boots. He focused on his breathing, on the metronome of his steps. He thought of nothing but the next 100 meters, then the next. He passed a few strugglers, offering a tight nod, but no words. Energy was too precious to waste. At the halfway point, a checkpoint where stern-faced evaluators scanned numbers and offered water, Marcus allowed himself a glance at his watch. He was on time, but the second half was always the killer. The road seemed to lengthen, the hills to grow steeper. His mouth was a desert, his uniform a sodden second skin. Around the 9th mile, disaster struck. Not for him, but for a young American soldier a few yards ahead. The man, his face pale and waxy, stumbled violently. His leg buckled underneath him with a sickening, audible pop. He cried out, crashing to the dirt in a tangle of limbs and rucksack, clutching his knee, his face contorted in agony. The candidates immediately around him slowed, hesitated. The rule was unambiguous. You stop for no one. The march was an individual test. To assist was to risk your own time, your own chance at the badge. It was the ultimate, cruel dilemma of the test, mission versus man. Marcus Thorne did not break stride. For 2 more paces, his boots thudded against the dirt in rhythm. And then, with a decisive crunch of gravel, he stopped. The act was so abrupt, so counter to the driven momentum of the event, that it drew the attention of everyone nearby. Without a word, Marcus shrugged off his own ruck, letting it thump to the ground. He knelt beside the injured soldier, his voice low and calm, cutting through the man's pained gasps. Easy, mate. Let me see. His hands, large and surprisingly gentle, probed the knee. It was already swelling. A dislocation, likely. You're done with the march, Marcus stated, not unkindly. This needs a medic. The soldier groaned. My EIB. Forget it, Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He looked up at the other candidates who had paused, their faces torn. "You lot, keep going. Go on." Shamed or spurred, they continued, leaving the two men on the side of the road. Marcus then stood, raised a massive arm, and flagged down the follow-up medical truck that trailed the march. He helped the evaluators load the injured man, providing a crisp, accurate report on the injury. As the truck pulled away, Marcus stood alone in the dust kicked up by the passing candidates. He looked at his watch. 5 precious minutes lost. He looked down the endless, sun-baked road. He looked at his ruck on the ground. The silent, stoic discipline of the palace guard had trained him to ignore pain, to stand firm. But the soldier he had come here to find had made a different choice. He bent, grunting with effort, and hoisted the ruck back onto his screaming shoulders. He took a long, deliberate drink of warm water. And then, Royal Guard Marcus Thorne began to run. It was not a sprint. That would be impossible. It was a punishing, jarring, relentless trot. His body, already deep in an energy deficit, rebelled. His lungs burned, his vision blurred at the edges. Every footfall sent a jolt of pain from his blistered feet to his pounding temples. But he ran. He passed candidates who were now walking, their own spirits broken by the heat and distance. He passed them with a fixed, distant stare, a machine of pure will. The evaluators in the trailing vehicles watched, radios crackling with updates. Big Ben is moving again. He's making up time. Unbelievable. The story spread down the road faster than Marcus could run it. The Brit who stopped. The Brit who was now running himself into the ground to salvage his test. A strange energy began to infect the remaining candidates. Those who were flagging found a little more strength. No one wanted to be outdone by the guy who had already lost 5 minutes to help a fallen comrade. The final mile was a vision of pure agony for Marcus. The finish line was in sight, a cluster of vehicles and officials. His world had narrowed to the next painful breath, the next leaden step. His uniform was soaked through, his face a mask of dust and sweat. With a final, gut-wrenching surge, he crossed the line and stumbled to a halt, bracing his hands on his knees, his entire body heaving. An evaluator grabbed his shoulder. "Time." Marcus gasped, unable to speak. The evaluator looked at his stopwatch, then, at Marcus, his expression unreadable. He showed him the clock. 3 hours. And 2 minutes. He had missed the standard by 120 seconds. Marcus Thorne, the Royal Guardsman, had failed the ruck march. The world came back in painful, gasping increments. The sound of other candidates finishing, some triumphant, some collapsing. The evaluator's hand was still on his shoulder, not unkindly. "Go get some water, soldier. You gave it everything." The words were meant to console, but they felt like a verdict. Marcus nodded, a stiff, mechanical motion, and shuffled away from the finish line, his body a shipwreck of exhaustion and defeat. He had failed, by the most heartbreaking of margins, born not from lack of fitness or will, but from a choice. The irony was a bitter pill. He had come to prove he was more than a ceremonial soldier, and, in doing so, he had performed the most fundamentally soldierly act, sacrificing his own mission for a brother in arms. And it had cost him the badge. He found a quiet patch of shade under a pine tree, away from the mingling crowds of successes and failures. He drank water, not tasting it, and stared at the dirt. The camaraderie, the respect he'd earned over the week, felt like ashes now. He imagined the reports back at the Knightsbridge barracks. Guardsman Thorne attempted the American test. He failed. The nuance would be lost. The story of the injured soldier would be an afterthought, if it was told at all. He was preparing himself for the quiet, respectful disappointment of his British superiors and the closing of this chapter of doubt. He would return to his horse, to his post, the question forever unanswered. Later that afternoon, the remaining candidates, those who had passed every task and the ruck march, were assembled on a dusty parade square for the award ceremony. Marcus stood with the other non-qualifiers off to the side, a spectator. He stood at a familiar, parade rest attention, his face a blank mask, the years of discipline allowing him to hide the crushing disappointment. The sun beat down on the rows of successful infantrymen, their faces beaming with pride as names were called. The EIB, a silver rifleman's figure set against a blue infantry background, was pinned to each chest. It was a proud moment for the U.S. Army, a celebration of its finest. The presiding officer, a grizzled colonel with a chest full of ribbons, finished the formal presentations. He paused, looking over the assembly. The chatter died down. "There's one more thing." The colonel's voice boomed across the square. "This course isn't just about checking tasks. It's about testing the heart of an infantryman. It's about judgment under pressure, courage, and the unwavering commitment to the man next to you. Sometimes, the test reveals a soldier's character in ways the score sheet can't capture." He turned his gaze directly toward the small group of non-qualifiers. Guardsman Marcus Thorne, front and center. A ripple of confusion, then intense interest, went through the crowd. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. For a second, he was paralyzed. Had he breached some protocol? Was there to be a formal reprimand for interfering? He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, and marched to the front of the formation with perfect, instinctive bearing. He stopped before the colonel and rendered a sharp British-style salute, which the colonel returned. "Guardsman Thorne," the colonel began, his voice carrying to every ear. "You were observed at the 9th-mile marker of the Ruck March, rendering immediate and effective aid to a fallen comrade, despite the clear and personal cost to your own qualification. You displayed the core tenet of the infantry. I will never leave a fallen comrade. You then displayed a level of physical and mental fortitude I have rarely seen, attempting to recover your time in an extraordinary display of will." The colonel paused, letting the words sink into the silent square. The expert infantryman badge has strict, non-negotiable standards. You did not meet the time standard for the foot march. Therefore, you do not qualify for the EIB. Marcus's gaze remained fixed on a point 1,000 yards ahead, his jaw tight. This public acknowledgement was a greater torture than the march itself. However, the colonel continued, his tone shifting. The United States Army also recognizes exceptional valor, sacrifice, and embodiment of soldierly values outside the scope of a specific badge. Your actions today were not a failure. They were a testament to the highest ideals of any army in the world. The colonel nodded to a senior sergeant major, who stepped forward. In his hands was not the small blue-backed EAB, but a framed certificate and a distinctive, dark blue medal on a red, white, and blue ribbon, the Army Achievement Medal. On behalf of the commanding general of the infantry school, the colonel said, "It is my distinct honor to present you with the United States Army Achievement Medal for your selfless conduct and exceptional professionalism, which brought great credit upon yourself, the British Army, and reflected the finest traditions of the United States Armed Forces." For the first time since he had arrived at Fort Moore, Marcus Thorne's impeccable military bearing broke. He blinked rapidly, his eyes glistening. He accepted the framed certificate and the medal case, his hands trembling slightly. He managed a choked, "Thank you, sir." The colonel shook his hand firmly. Around him, the entire assembly of American infantrymen, the hard-nosed sergeants, the gruff candidates, erupted. They weren't just clapping, they were cheering, whistling, a thunderous, roaring ovation that echoed across the Georgia pines. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated respect, more meaningful than any silent ceremony at the palace. In that moment, under the foreign sun, surrounded by the warriors of a different army, Marcus Thorne found his answer. The badge on his chest was not the one he came for, but the one he had earned. He was a soldier. The flight back to London was a journey between worlds. The humid heat of Georgia was replaced by the damp chill of an English autumn. The cacophony of Fort Moore faded into the familiar, orderly quiet of the Knightsbridge barracks. Marcus Thorne returned not to fanfare, but to the muted curiosity of his squadron. He placed the U.S. Army Achievement Medal and certificate carefully in his footlocker, a private treasure. The story, however, had wings. It traveled through regimental gossip, was confirmed by an official letter of commendation from the U.S. Army to the British Ministry of Defense, and soon became a quiet legend. His fellow guardsmen regarded him with a new, subtle respect. They saw the same tall, silent man who polished his cuirass to a mirror's shine, who sat atop Titan with immutable stillness. But now they knew what lay beneath the ceremonial shell. The question that had driven him to America had been answered, not with a badge, but with an act. He was no longer just the guardsman who went to try the American test. He was the guardsman who chose the soldier over the test. Life on post resumed its timeless rhythm. The changing of the guard, the mounted patrols, the endless polishing. But something within Marcus had settled. The restless churning was gone. When a tourist child stumbled and fell crying near his horse, Marcus, without moving his head or breaking his statue-like pose, would speak in a low, calm voice from atop Titan. "You're all right, young un. Up you get." The parents would stare, astonished at the human voice from the iconic, silent figure. When a new, young guardsman struggled with the soul-crushing boredom of a 4-hour vigil, Marcus would later, in the barracks, share no grand stories, but simply say, "The mind is your own guardroom. Discipline it." He led by the example of his newfound, quiet certainty. Months later, a package arrived for him from the United States. It was from the soldier whose knee he had helped, now recovered. Inside was a simple, polished brass challenge coin from the soldier's unit, and a note, asterisk, "To Big Ben, I'll never forget what you did. Your infantry, wherever you wear a uniform. Mike." Asterisk Marcus kept the coin in his pocket, a solid, real touchstone. The ultimate validation came during a major state ceremony, a full inspection by a visiting U.S. Army general, a man who had heard the story from the infantry school. As the general walked the line of immaculate guardsmen, he stopped before Marcus. He took in the gleaming armor, the plumed helmet, the majestic horse. He looked Marcus directly in the eye, gave a small, knowing nod that only Marcus could see, and moved on. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Marcus Thorne stood guard, as he had 1,000 times before. The crowd snapped pictures. Children pointed at the fairy tale soldier. But he was no longer just a fixture of the palace. He was a man who had stood at a crossroads in the Georgia dust and made a choice that defined him. The American challenge had sought to break him. Instead, it had revealed him to others and, most importantly, to himself. He had traveled to Fort Moore to find a soldier, and he had returned having proven that the soldier had been there all along, standing guard.